President Cyril Ramaphosa has enacted legislation on the Local Government Municipal Systems Amendment Bill of 2022. Now, the presidency said over the weekend the law is intended to improve the functioning capacity and ethical standards at local government level. Now, some of the areas of focus are managing the way in which senior appointments are made and also to try and prevent high-ranking officials from holding political office in political parties. The law also hopes to turn around the performance of local government and to prevent abuse of public resources. Author and analyst Professor Susan Booysen joins us now to discuss whether the new legislation or the implementation of the existing laws is what we will need to save local government. Prof, thanks so much for coming through. Welcome to Morning Live.
Morning, Zakina. Thank you. And
it's so good to kind of have some semblance of normalcy, just having people back in studio.
Indeed, indeed. It's been a long time since I've been in the studio.
It certainly has. Now, Prof, just looking at this piece of legislation, a very, very important piece of legislation, Local Government Municipal Systems Amendment Bill of 2022. But looking at what it's intended to do, let's just look at that a little closely. Did we need new legislation, or were there certain deficits in the previous legislation that we needed to plug? What's your assessment on that?
Yes, there certainly are so many deficits in existing legislation, existing plans, strategies to correct local government. And so there is absolutely a need to plug certain holes in it and obvious deficits, because we know about the politicization of civil service and local government administrations. That is a huge problem. It's a big question whether this type of legislation, important as it is in small ways, is sufficient at all to make a difference. It is a big morass of problems, and here is one little point that is being improved, corrected, no doubt about that. And it will in all probability be presented as a big scheme, a big step. In a way, government really needs these little pointers to show, yes, there's a plan, we're doing things are changing. That's a way it will be used. And it is important, but it is such a small correction to a huge, huge problem that will demand much more overall. Because there's little doubt that local government system in South Africa has generally failed, and that government, instead of correcting local government, and this could be one little step to correct it, but it's a small part of the overall, but instead of that, thinking of introducing at district level the alternative systems and to do correction in that way, but it is going to be a long road to correct it all.
So a long road to correct it all. And as you say, government obviously cannot turn a blind eye. They cannot pretend that they are not hearing all of the noise and the consternation pertaining to local government and its failures. But is this, in your view, the most important aspect to address?
It is an important aspect to address, yes, because politicization, people serving in party political positions as officials, and this legislation is only dealing with that top level. They cannot also become, for example, municipal managers or those reporting to the municipal managers. So they're skimming off a little layer at the top. Important, a very, very influential part of is, for example, financial management and overall governance effectiveness at the local level. They're targeting that little level and saying those people may not be officials of political parties, and the proposed legislation says that they prescribes more general professional levels of recruitment into advertising of positions and under what circumstances those positions can be re-advertised, to try and prevent at that important municipal level that it will be party political apparatchiks who fill those positions. And that is a very, very important part of it. But then it ignores, I would say, the bigger picture, and that is For people to be party political apparatchiks and employees, etc., they need not necessarily hold high political office. They needn't even hold party political membership. We all know that just by association with political parties, things can really be influenced and impacted negatively, for example.
So just looking at the wording of the statement, and it says, this is to improve ethical standards at local government through managing the way senior appointments are made and by preventing high-ranking officials from holding political office in political parties. Now, you've just mentioned part of that, the fact that people don't have to necessarily hold high office in a political party to be able to still politically influence what happens at that level. But let's talk about ethical standards. How does a piece of legislation assist us in addressing this deficit? Because we've spoken about ethics and leaders and ethical leadership ad nauseum, and it continues to be a problem.
Indeed, indeed. You know, ethics, morality, that compulsion to dedication to serve people, that comes in a political culture and personal orientations of those leaders that are being elected. A piece of legislation that is going to control who can be appointed, the level of party political association membership, leadership of a political party, to what extent that is going to affect national or local level on a national scale, governments, that's going to be such a small impact, and there is no necessary correlation. And for me, that tells us how that this piece of legislation, this improvement, granted, is going to project it as a much bigger step than it actually is. Because in a way, this government does things is to project any small piece of evidence as major proof that some things are happening, whereas it is a much bigger problem. And that, for example, we can also see in the last week, the report that came out from the ANC's Integrity Committee, sometimes also called commission, but I would say committee, and that they're really showing how they are at odds. They make a few recommendations on also prominent leaders and officials of the governing party, and yet those do not necessarily get acted on. And that is another indication of ethics and standards and how the type of detriments that there are to their effective implementation. If at the highest level in the ANC as governing party, those recommendations of Integrity Committee, which is held out as evidence that steps are taken when there is wrongdoing of officials, where that is not being given effect to, where the Integrity Committee doesn't have the necessary powers, which really remains a subcommittee of the National Executive Committee of the ANC. And it's at that level that we need to look, if we look for consistency. Yes, the ANC is just one of the governing parties at local government elections, but we know that's where the bulk of the municipalities, the party by which the bulk of municipalities are controlled. And so it is that kind of internal integrity body that will embody a political culture of ethics and serving people. That's where one really has to look for change.
So if one looks at this a little more closely, could one argue at some level that this legislation is in one way admitting that cadre deployment perhaps is a bit problematic?
I would definitely say so, in a big way. That is addressing cadre deployment by another name, definitely.
So now that you've recognized that that is a problem, again, one of the big power dynamics in politics is, of course, the power of perception. And the perceptions that exist around political power, the sense of entitlement, and what happens at municipal level. For example, you see quite a few municipalities struggling with not just the appointments of municipal managers for various reasons, but also once they are in place, they are almost moved around at will, depending on which party or which faction within a party is in power. And it speaks to the point you made about the politicization of administration. And surely that needs to be addressed more keenly.
Yes, indeed. The problem of appointment of municipal managers, as one study that Mapungubu Institute also did, shows huge problems at that level. And also, especially when local governments change, when a new party comes in or a coalition comes into power at local government level, and there's a previous municipal manager that essentially had been appointed because that person was seen by the ruling party at that moment as being effective and possibly just serving them, or possibly making a broader municipal governance impact. That is possible. But then a new party comes in, and that can go either way across any political party political change at that level. And then they feel they are stuck with a municipal manager that they're not in favor of, that they do not think will serve the implementation of their policies. And in a few of the big municipalities, Nelson Mandela Bay is one of them, for example. We see problems coming up in eThekwini, for example. There are contests about the municipal manager to the extent that rival factions of the alliances of governing parties even appoint dual municipal managers. And it's at that level too that one has to, that level illustrates other problems that really need to be addressed that are not yet going to be addressed through this legislative change we're seeing now.
So to what extent will this amendment actually help address some of these problems, including the corruption that seems to be endemic at this point?
I believe this piece of legislation, it could take a little stab. I just want like changing one little light on a huge Christmas tree in a shopping mall. That is the impact that I think this kind of change that we see now will be made. It is a big problem, literally all-encompassing at local government level, as we also see in Auditor General reports, for example. And it will take much, much more concerted fixing and enforcement of ethics of governance. Those principles are there, agreements are there on paper, but when it has to be given effect to at local government level, very little comes of it. And I'm afraid this piece of legislation is not going to bring a total change of seasons to good governance and honesty and integrity. There needs to be enforcement of not just general standards, but those cultures of ethics that we talked about. Certainty that there are going to be consequences when local government officials, as at other levels of government as well, but now we're talking local government, certainty that there will be repercussions if there is corruption. But it's all about the game of procurement and securing contracts, and that is not going to change because of this small little change we see now.
So given the objective reality as it pertains to local government and of these positions, is it possible at this point, would you say, to depoliticize the administration in local government?
I do not think it is. Party politics is so fused into local government. It determines just about every decision that's taken, every contract that is awarded, goes all around to all the different political parties. And it is going to be so difficult to stamp that out. It is a huge problem. Wall to wall, and that system of local government really needs a big overhaul, and maybe a little change here and there can give a signal, can help change that perception that things are changing. But overall, it is an integrated system also. One cannot just change local government in isolation, especially when it comes to the ethics and the integrity of that government. it's a system that has truly gone wrong in so many ways. It didn't work out the way it was intended in design. And we know the design of the local government system followed a few years after the 1994 implementation of the national and provincial orders. Local followed. It has always been acknowledged that it's not perfect, but it is far, far from perfect and falling short. And the way in which that government is elected, also this mixed electoral system, that is held out as a big example to follow. Also now at national and possibly provincial, but national level, people propagating electoral system change. And yet at local government election, even having those representatives elected by wards, bringing them closer to home, has really not brought accountability, contact, representation, accountability overall. Definitely. No, not an example to go by.
And we're out of time, but just very briefly, Prof, the rot runs very deep. It's not just at the higher levels, the top echelons where the problem is. Even clerks who deal with these tenders, at the lowest level, are involved in the corrupt activity. So how do you deal with that?
This is such a big question, an important one, because unless it's dealt with at every level in municipalities and not just at this, as the current legislation shows, at the top level of the administration, local government, unless you really take it throughout the ranks, you are not going to get that overall difference. One can only hope that as political power balances out and as the ANC is less assured of its actual majorities, that party and other parties, we see Democratic Alliance in other parts of the country, they've also been losing control of municipalities. One can only hope that as the loss of local power becomes more of a possibility and a likelihood, then political parties will be forced to be exercising more integrity, to be accountable and to be shown that they really care for people and not just for themselves. So I see it as only a cultural change at that essential level that is going to force political parties and their representatives, whether it's in a party political side in councils or in bureaucracies, to really make a change and really come to terms that change is essential.
Professor Susan Booysen, thanks so much for your time this morning. Analyst and author, Professor Susan Booysen, discussing whether the Local Government Municipal System Amendment Bill of 2022 will actually seriously improve South Africa's local government system, often reported to be on the brink of total collapse. Always want to hear from you, so you can let us know your views as well at Morning Live SABC.